Good evening, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. Jazakallah so much for staying with us. Last week, Benjamin Netanyahu made a visit to the United States and he addressed a joint session of the US Congress. While some lawmakers gave him a standing ovation, there was one individual who stood by and raised a placard. And that placard read, Netanyahu is a war criminal. That was none other than Michigan Representative Rashida Tlaib, who is currently a leading progressive Democrat and a fiercely outspoken opponent of Israel's genocide in Gaza. It has shown that even though the United States remains the key ally within Israel, members of the Senate continue to voice their disgust at the thousands of deaths that are currently happening in Gaza. I'd like to welcome Professor Adrienne Pine, who is a professor of anthropology at the Californian Institute of Integral Studies, and she's also the coordinator of the International Coalition to Stop Genocide in Palestine. She joins me from Washington. Professor Pine, good day. Thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Pine, I want to talk about that address that was made, and you see Rashida Tlaib holding that placard right there. That really was a sort of, as they would say, standing out from the rest, the quote-unquote odd one out, but there wasn't really anything odd about it. It truly was a representation that even though the US pours billions of US dollars into Israel's genocide in Gaza, there are those individuals that are saying, not in my name.
Indeed, and she was even made braver by the fact that her colleagues who were opposing the speech simply didn't show up. They didn't take the risk that she took of actually going there and protesting in person. So she really was all alone. And it's just astounding what she has had to put up with as a Palestinian in an atmosphere that is as Zionist as Tel Aviv here in Washington, D.C., and speaks to her character.
Yeah. Professor Pine, I want to talk about the protests that had happened because obviously this was going to be the case. The protesters had every right because obviously in the US democracy, it allows for that, of course, it needs to be done in a peaceful manner, which you could see on television, it was done. But really, it just showed the anger of many of the US citizens. And I'm not just talking about the Arab American residents within Washington, D.C., or the Arab American citizens across the whole of the United States, but just so many different ethnic groups from, Caucasian to Latino to African American. There is the sense of pure disgust towards what Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet is currently doing right now in Gaza.
Well, if there's anything that Netanyahu's visit to Washington, D.C. has demonstrated very clearly, it's that our government's support for Israel is harming us all. There were millions, I don't know how many tens of millions of dollars spent on a massive police presence for what, as you pointed out, were peaceful protesters. Our police forces across the country are being trained by Israel. They are being armed with Israeli weapons. We are being repressed for our support for Israel. And that, in addition to, of course, the horror of the genocide in Gaza, is making it more clear than ever that this system is unsustainable. The police that were there came from all over. There were hundreds of police who came from New York City, New York City police who came to repress peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C. The cops who were there from all the different agencies in D.C. were dressed up. They looked like Marvel comic characters. They had, these ridiculous sort of outfits on as if we were going to throw bombs at them or something. They tear gassed us. This is, the nation's capital of Washington, D.C., and we're merely peacefully protesting. So it really does, right now, there's tremendous unity in opposition to our government's policies in supporting the genocide and in the harm that this is doing to us as well.
Yeah, if you put it that way, they dress like Marvel. They should have just walked straight into Comic-Con down there in San Diego, if that was the case. Professor Pine, when October the 7th happened, I think we always talk about education being very important. And of course, you're part of an organization called the International Coalition to Stop Genocide in Palestine. I mean, I read a stat that, you know, if you were living under a rock, you would automatically support Israel and everything that they're doing to try and, flush out Hamas. You look months on, and I mean, we're moving closer to it being a year since the genocide has started. So that's 9 months. How has the perception changed of the American public? I want to start off in Capitol Hill because that's where, of course, the big decisions are made with regards to the US government. How has the perception changed within Washington, D.C., and filtering down into greater America with regards to America's continuous support of Israel in a genocide that shows no signs of stopping?
Well, I think it has been a really important shift over the past 10 months, 9 or 10 months, because really the Zionist narrative was nearly impenetrable in this country. Any criticism of Israel was automatically labeled as anti-Semitic, even when it was coming from Jews, and yet we're seeing these images on the television that are just unspeakably horrifying every single day. And there are fewer and fewer people who are, outright coming and defending every move that Israel does, which was sort of what we had going on beforehand. However, in the halls of Congress, that remains the norm. And there's such a tremendous disconnect between our elected representatives, Democrat and Republican alike, and what the people of this country want, which is to stop sending our tax dollars to genocide and instead spend them on things like healthcare and education that we don't have access to. So there is a shift. I think particularly the student protests in the spring and the violent repression by Israeli trained police against those students who were peacefully protesting in solidarity with Palestinians opened a lot of people's eyes. They were doing a really important service in terms of education, far better than what professors in these neoliberal Zionist institutions have done.
Talking of neoliberalist, Professor Pine, I mean, when you listen to that address to Congress and the round of applause Netanyahu received, is it just a classic case of the sheep really singing for its supper when you look at that right there?
I think for some of the Congress members, like for example John Fetterman, some of the people who are truly, ideological Zionists and receive the most money from AIPAC, I think that's the case. And I'm not sure for the rest. It's absurd living through this moment of a presidential election. Obviously, Biden had to step out, but he's been the biggest supporter of Israel, but so is Trump. And Kamala Harris is trying to walk this line where she's not as, murderous as Biden, but she's still fully supporting Israel. And, it's hard to say. I mean, on the one hand, Netanyahu, AIPAC is giving so much money to politicians in this country, but those politicians are the ones that are sending all our money, the U.S. citizens' money, and people who live in the U.S. and pay tax dollars to fund his wars and to fund his economy. And I mean, it's hard for me to understand, other than simply lining their pockets with AIPAC money, why U.S. politicians would have these priorities.
Professor Pine, one final question, and I want to talk about word on the ground and feelings on the ground. America, though, even though it is, amongst the top economies in the world, it's still a country trying to reel itself back from COVID-19. Here in South Africa, we keep a keen eye on it because, of course, we have the AGOA agreement with the United States of America, which looks to be on its way to being renewed. But the economy is still not where many Americans would like it to see, and some see Donald Trump as supposedly that person that could resuscitate it. But the fact that these tax money, the dollars that are going to Israel, is it not infuriating the US citizens right now, seeing that the money that they earn, the tax that they pay towards, is going to a war that is, well, not a war, a genocide, excuse me, that is thousands and thousands of miles away and really does not serve the interest of the American citizen?
Well, there's such a tremendous disconnect in this country. Thanks in large part to corporate-owned mass media that support the U.S. military budget. The majority of our budget goes to militarization. The majority of our budget. So we've got over around 800 bases around the world. We're an empire, but a completely failing empire. We're rotting from the inside. But people instead, it's easier to blame migrants, which is something both the Democrats and Republicans do. It's easier to blame anybody else but the military-industrial complex, and that is a challenge that those of us who are fighting the genocide and fighting the U.S., incredibly harmful imperialist U.S. policy around the world confront every day.
Professor Pine, unfortunately, we've come out of time. Thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal TV on News in Focus. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
That's Professor Adrienne Pine. She is a professor of anthropology at the Californian Institute of Integral Studies. She's also coordinator for the International Coalition to Stop Genocide in Palestine. We're not done yet with Palestine. We come here home. The University of Pretoria is about to submit a resolution to its Senate tomorrow, calling for it to support Palestine and educational institutions and academics. I'll be speaking with Mark Wegeroff after the break.